This podcast, Strange, Rare, and Peculiar, is for kind of those in the know about homeopathy, deepening your knowledge, bringing you more information about what you need to know and maybe what you can leave aside about homeopathy.
Homeo what?
Homeo what? Those of you who don't know, Alastair and I, we run a homeopathy school, the Academy of Homeopathy Education. We have a foundation that supports all things homeopathy, but in particular research. And so what this means is that we live and breathe this. We are researching, we are teaching, we are learning every day. And I think the biggest thing for us in terms of why this felt important to do is that we see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases in our teaching clinic, through our helpline, Homeopathy Help Now, and through our own practices. And what that means is we have a sense of what is working. We also see what happens when people go pretty far off script using homeopathic medicine, and the fact that there are actual consequences to it. And so this podcast, Stranger and Peculiar, is a way for us to both deepen our knowledge, have fun with some history, some trivia, some fun facts about homeopathy.
I want factoids.
Yeah, lots of factoids. But also to really deepen knowledge by asking difficult questions, by challenging paradigms, by not saying there's only one way to do something, but to engage in a critical thinking practice that requires us to ask some questions about what we do and how we do it.
I was thinking about what you were telling me just before, because you listened to a podcast today, right?
Yeah, I did. Started my day
right.
with a podcast.
Yeah, I'd rather have breakfast myself, but anyway. I'm fascinated by that because that's kind of informal learning. You're using it not for just entertainment, it's a bit of edutainment, but I'm not sure if I like that term. But you're using it because you want to learn some stuff and you're walking the dog.
Yeah, totally. So, my morning routine is...
Where is the dog?
Oh, we'll hear her at some point. Right. Background noises of life in this podcast. Mm-hmm. So, my morning routine is yoga before I even turn on the lights. I have my yoga practice, and then I do a sunrise walk with the dog. And I often will listen to music or a podcast. And the podcast I listened to this morning was one of the Gwyneth Paltrow Goop podcasts, which I love.
How's Gwyneth? How's she doing?
She just turned 50.
Really?
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, but she...
I remember that.
I think she's just such a... I really appreciate what she's doing because she's really willing to push some boundaries, to ask some questions, or to engage in topics that are uncomfortable to talk about. And anyway, so the podcast that I listened to today, she was talking with... I actually don't know what... I think this woman is a doctor of functional medicine. But she was talking about menopause. And what was really interesting about the podcast for me was how... the conversation about sort of female reproductive health is so incredibly biomedical. I mean, there are plenty of people who, in our line of work, who will talk about sort of the more, how women move through the cycles of life, the maiden, mother, and crone cycle, and so on and so forth. But when you get into any of the hormonal challenges, it goes directly into this reductionistic biomedical paradigm.
Yeah, there's not a lot of mystery in that conversation, is there?
No, and it was amazing. And it was, I definitely learned things. I'm often listening to things to expand the knowledge base I have, and also to challenge what my belief system is, to make sure that I'm, peeking into the corners, to really understand things. But listening to this podcast, it was really interesting, especially because of the topic we are talking about today, which is about this idea of the characteristic symptom in homeopathy, or even the strange, rare, and peculiar symptom that is what guides a homeopath to make a clinical decision. And how when you get into this, sort of this realm of bioidentical hormones, it's very different. It's very much about, even though it's considered individualization because they're using a bioidentical product, it's still about meeting a standard. There's still this idea that health is about when you can tick the boxes that you're in the range. So whether it's a blood test, whether it's a urinalysis, whether it's, a hair analysis, what they're looking for is a range of expectation so that you can sort of fix that, so that you can bring someone into range by filling in a gap. But I think one of the things I wanted to talk with you about today was how while that would be the ultimate goal in homeopathy, we wouldn't be starting there and thinking about how to fill in one particular gap, right? So like for example, if we're talking about this idea of the female hormonal system, I mean, so many of my clients, so many of your clients, so many clients that come to homeopathy are women in, from their childbearing years on up through, that transition in the hormonal cycle and the challenges that are faced, that people face there. And, we homeopaths will get the whole picture, mental, emotional, and physical. But if someone, and this is the challenge point that I want to talk about, is if someone is both using the sort of biomedical model of fill in the gaps, if you are high in estrogen, then you want to either, I'm oversimplifying this, but elevate progesterone or lower the estrogen in some way. What happens to the way that we view that as homeopaths if we're interacting with someone who's on both sides of that equation in that system?
I mean, you've taken us right to the kind of practicalities of what we do because obviously what we're doing is using similar to push against a disordered vital force to re-establish balance. That would be the model that we're using. That's it. And so practically, how does that work? That's what you're asking?
Yeah.
How on earth can we have both working at the same time? I mean, the only way I could respond to that at this stage would be that in my experience, so I've been, doing this since the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, and that would be that the vital force is somewhat forgiving. And that sort of pithy yet inadequate answer kind of describes my approach, and that is, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't think there's no research, I can tell you that right now, of the outcomes of an integrative approach when one side... See, an integrative approach kind of makes a bit of sense when everyone's coming from the same side.
Right.
So an integrative approach where you've got Chinese medicine and homeopathy might make a bit of sense because at the end of the day they're using vital force as part of their analytics. But when you've got biomedical or naturopathic
or reductionistic
or straight up reductionistic thinking applied to that, then where does the homeopath or where does the Chinese medicine or where's the shaman that might be working also with that client?
It's funny, right? Because it's more confusing than I think we would expect.
Yeah, I don't know that we've gone to a really interesting place because I don't think anyone wants to get into that because in integrative medicine, I spend lots of time in the integrative medicine world.
Yeah.
And absolutely no one is thinking about that. Integrative medicine, for the most part, I'm going to say something outrageous, but for the most part, it seems to be more reductionistic or biomedical physicians realizing the paucity of options they've got and looking to the complementary world and identifying what they can use without going so far outside of their scope and actually needing to really adjust their paradigm of working.
Okay, so can I ask, so if we were going to make a visual of that, then it would be that orthodox or allopathic medicine, sort of the model that, most of the world agrees on, would be at the center of this, and every other therapeutic intervention would be peripheral.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've got a different visual. I've got a big balloon and then a whole lot of little balloons around the big balloon.
I like that. That's pretty
like
good.
Christmas.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's almost, I mean, I'd be fascinated to learn from people that have identified this kind of working challenge that we have and see how they reconcile it with themselves. And again, I say any research around that, I can immediately start to think of some interesting research questions, but how would we go about answering them?
Yeah. Now, I can already say that if people are going to be posting comments and things, there are going to be a lot of homeopaths who say, well, I just use endocrine sarcodes, or I do this, or I do that.
Yeah, right.
And so it's an interesting conversation to have about how, and again, we said, these conversations are about getting us to our edges, to ask questions about what we do as homeopaths and how do we really reconcile this. So, I brought up how do we reconcile it in the external environment. So, this was just based on having listened to this podcast this morning that brought the question to my mind. But at the end of the day, we face it internally as well with using multiple homeopathic remedies to theoretically address the same challenge of rebalancing the endocrine system. But at the end of the day, and I think this is how I want to kind of bring us back to what our topic is around this idea of the characteristic or strange, rare, and peculiar symptom in homeopathy, because there's a certain point where if the homeopath's job, right, if Hahnemann sets us forward and says that the most important thing is the totality of symptoms that you perceive, you've got to recognize what the appropriate totality is that needs to be treated. And sometimes we use a small totality, sometimes we use a global totality. How is it affected if another modality, or if a homeopath is both treating a small totality and a large totality at the same time?
Well, that's where I think, that's where things unravel. And again, there's there's a bit of a judgment around it, but the system of homeopathy, as I understand it, it is a whole system of medicine. And that whole system of medicine requires all parts of the theory and philosophy to be in operation. As soon as you start shaving off parts of the whole healing system, then I think compromise happens along the way.
That's just it.
And so, going back to what you said, for me, Hahnemann never says totality of symptoms. He says totality of characteristic symptoms.
That's correct.
And so, totality of characteristic symptoms. And then the next part is really critical. Ken Duran taught me this. I could have read the organon and understood it more clearly, but he said, no, Al. Ken is a homeopath in Sydney. Plays guitar. I don't know. I think he might be playing more guitar than homeopathy. But anyway, hi Ken. But he said, no. It's the totality of characteristic symptoms from when the patient was last healthy.
That's right.
And
Hahnemann says that in Aphorism 6. Aphorism 6 in the organon. Sorry to go off track, but and also for those who might be kind of new to the game, the Organon of Medicine is Hahnemann's philosophy book. It's the core philosophy book that's like our how-to manual for everything. And it's written in what we call an aphoristic style, so it's numbered paragraphs, each of which has sort of a pithy comment to be made. And then in this style, it's quite common to have footnotes that sort of that give sort of the background information. So anyway, Can
I just call you on something?
Yeah.
A pithy style? Are you kidding? It's a rant.
Hahnemann, I'm talking
without
about
punctuation.
what the aphoristic style is in general.
We'll talk about
Hahnemann's
the
use of it in particular.
Anyway, get to your point.
So what you're talking about, I think, is a really important point, because Aphorism 6 in the Organon of Medicine is where Hahnemann talks about being the unbiased or unprejudiced or objective observer. But the part that gets lost, because I think Aphorism 6 often gets interpreted in a contemporary term, which is don't judge people, don't make assumptions about people, be unprejudiced in a very 21st century way. But in reality, this idea that Ken, hammered home to you is about what a homeopath is looking at is the point from which the person was last well. And Hahnemann begins that as early in the organon as the 6th paragraph, And
at the end of the day, that translates practically into our work as, that's the beginning of the totality of symptoms.
Exactly. Well, Aphorism 7 is the totality aphorism. Let's have a look. Happen to have a couple of organons right in front of us. And just for reference purposes, we, in our teaching, we mostly work from Wenda O'Reilly's 6th edition of the Organon, and we then have other editions of the Organon from which we will draw references to show the differences between, and obviously go through the different editions of the Organon. But Hahnemann says in Aphorism 7, in cases of disease where there is no obvious occasioning or maintaining cause to be removed, in other words, if you've got a splinter in your foot, take the splinter out. If you live in a damp basement, get out of the basement. We can perceive nothing but the disease signs. Therefore, it must be the symptoms alone by which the disease demands and can point to the appropriate medicine for its relief, along with regard for any contingent miasm and with attention to the attendant circumstances. In other words, that totality of symptoms, that full picture, is what guides the homeopath. And it's not just symptoms, but it's the characteristic symptoms.
Do you know what I think? I think, in my own understanding of homeopathy and the differences between practitioners is essentially that paragraph.
Totally.
You know, I don't think there's a homeopath, well, there might be one or two around somewhere, but we all agree on similars.
Well, we should. It's the first principle from which homeopathy was.
Most of us agree on single remedy.
Oh, I wouldn't agree with that. Not anymore.
Well, I mean, over-the-counter,
Non-combo remedies you're talking about.
Yeah, but single remedy. Most of us have a working understanding of less is better. You know, give enough so that the vital force pushes back. The idea of a minimum dose. Most of us are okay with using remedies and potency, say whatever Avogadro's number is, above 12C, whatever it is, 13. But totality, I don't think he defined it. Well, actually, nowadays, doing this for 30-something years and teaching for a whole bunch of years, I used to teach that this was the poorest defined principle of homeopathy.
I would disagree.
But I think I've wound myself back a little bit because I think it's actually quite clear.
Yeah, it is. And especially, I think once... Okay, I'm going to say something that I'm not entirely sure of, but I would venture a guess that Hahnemann got clearer on this after his understanding of chronic diseases. Because if you think about it, right?
Oh, okay.
So if you think about this, when Hahnemann, before Hahnemann began his evaluation of homeopathy as early as 1816. So he spent from 1816 to 1828 trying to figure out why he was only partially successful. In other words...
45, 55, so 60 years old. 61 years old.
Wow. And he was... So, you know, he has this system of medicine, and he says, yeah, I figured it out. I figured out how to remove the cause of disease, which results in a capital C cure. Mm-hmm. And then he says, well, actually, that's not entirely true. I take that back, because he was seeing cases relapse. And then he, you know, subsequently comes back with a revised approach to the practice of homeopathy. And it's gotten lost on a lot of people. Anyway, the reason that I bring this up is because if prior to that point, Hahnemann treated everything as if equal. And I think many homeopaths do that as well, because it's all, people talk about this idea of the simillimum. You need this one match, this perfect remedy. Mm-hmm. And I think the simillimum only holds water if you only think of Hahnemann's initial 4 principles. So in the beginning, you know, Hahnemann based everything on, you give one remedy at a time for the largest totality of symptoms that you could perceive. You prescribe according to the law of similars, and you give it in the minimum dose needed in order to excite a cure. But once you add the idea of a deeper chronic disease into that equation, it just doesn't, it's not as simple as that. And what that requires then is a systematic approach to the unraveling of chronic disease. And this brings us back to the very beginning. What that we started talking about is this tension now. If people are working to modulate these reductionistic biomedical aspects of a person's case. So the thyroid is underperforming, therefore I give thyroid item, along with whatever the quote-unquote constitutional remedy is. Now, we all know how I feel about the term constitutional remedy, which is really the chronic remedy for the largest totality of symptoms. It's a different definition, but we'll call it the chronic remedy. Yeah. So once you do that, you're interfering with the presenting totality, because you're removing what Hahnemann says is the most characteristic symptom, which is the strange, rare, and peculiar, the striking symptom. So as soon as you start to modulate the case outside of the largest totality, you start putting these little bits of, homeopathy in, or a bioidentical in, then what happens? Do you still have accessibility to see the largest totality of symptoms? I mean, I'm not saying right or wrong. I think it's just a question to ask.
But my approach has always been this. Actually, it's that reason why I wrote the method book, and it is that I would say probably when I started homeopathy, maybe 80% of my cases kind of straightforward in the sense that somebody's got a problem.
Yeah.
There's a totality of symptoms. I begin prescribing, and off we go.
Yeah. Same
I
here.
manage the case.
Yeah.
I would say now that that's kind of 60%. Maybe even 50%.
Yeah.
That might just be because the people that are drawn to us are iller, sicker.
Yeah.
You know, more sick. But hang on, let me finish my point because I'm going to lose it. Or have I lost it already?
No.
It's short-term memory loss. No, so it's all that misspent youth. But the point that I'm making is that suddenly with those cases, with all cases, I always start with homeopathy, right? But then you do meet the case every now and again. Totally. Where, you know, the remedy doesn't, the indicated remedy doesn't work. And traditionally, you know, that's when, well, even you know, very conservative homeopaths would say, well, that's when you might start thinking about, you know, a different way of going about it. And that's where I personally, in my own practice, started to look at, to deal with those difficult situations. Schussler or James Compton Burnett, organopathy. You know, different adjacent styles of homeopathy, both advocated that they were, you know, homeopaths, although that's somewhat controversial. And then start to look at those sorts of applications. So I always started first with homeopathy. Straight up, normal, no messing homeopathy. And then started to look at some of the adjuncts and different styles.
I just had to laugh because when you mentioned the method book, so when I think we should tell the story of how when
you missed your bus stop.
No, not that one.
Oh, well, you were so angry.
When we first met, you were writing the method book, and you were. We met at a conference and some years ago, and you were asking people, you know, to talk about their practice or whatever. And at the time, my practice was very, very integrative in that I had moved from practicing in a city where people were much more holistically minded, where homeopathy was very much on the table, and there was a lot of compliance. And I moved back to Philadelphia. This was in 2006, and I was flooded with clients that really needed help. And at this time, this was sort of the beginning of when I was seeing a lot of people on the spectrum, a lot of kids on the spectrum. And it was, and these moms were really concerned because their kids had clearly developed, you know, food sensitivities. They had allergies. You know, diets were being suggested to them. They weren't sure how they could, you know, carry out. Anyway, so I had gone to culinary school to learn how to help this population. You know, what do you do? How many black bean burgers is a 2-year-old going to eat? I mean, you know, learning how to deal with, you know, allergy safe and, you know, allergy safe cuisine, or, you know, this food as medicine concept was really important to me. Anyway, so when you were asking me about my practice, and I could see it in your face that you thought I was, you were a little bit appalled.
No, you're not right about that.
No?
No, because I've heard you tell this story.
Yeah.
And while I've never, you know, I know a bit about nutrition, but it's all from eating.
Yeah.
I also had adopted much more of an integrative approach, and I know that I think you totally misread my reaction. Yeah, totally. Because
I don't know.
Because I know that I was, you know, definitely heading in an integrative approach for these kind of exactly what you're talking about, these difficult clients. So I don't know, maybe I smelled a fart or something.
Must have been.
Maybe I don't know.
Maybe you did it. But anyway, what I was really happy about was subsequent to that realizing how much emphasis Hahnemann put on diet and regimen. You know, in other words, right livelihood. How do we live well for our body, both in how we you know, put food in our body? How do we engage in our day-to-day life, our relationships? How do we move our body? Do we get fresh air? And, you know, I hadn't really gotten to the point in my practice where I thought about homeopathy through that lens. In fact, I wasn't taught that. I don't think that ever came up as a part of my,
No.
Homeopathy learning. But, down the road when dealing with really difficult cases and just pouring through the organon, over and over again to try to figure out the answers to the problems, I realized that approach wasn't too far off. And I wonder if, because with homeopathy, the pill is that's the arrangement. People have their case, taken or received, and then the homeopath analyzes the case, and then there's a remedy that is, given, and that's supposed to be the catalyst for healing. But there's a part of it where the emphasis on the pill is really...
It's overdone.
It's overdone.
It's totally overdone, and it was never like that from the start.
It wasn't like...
And again, I've kind of had to unlearn that as I've gone through my practice.
Yeah.
But statistically, 15% of that book is about diet and regimen and the removal of obstacles to cure.
Yeah.
The organon. And, Hahnemann, from the very beginning, couldn't have asserted it more. Even in those letters to his clients, in the Francis Straiges book.
I love that.
Genius of Homeopathy.
If you are a homeopathy fan and you love the sort of intimacy of reading letters and how, one-to-one communication happens, Francis Straiges, who is an English homeopath, had put together just the most wonderful book. And I highly recommend it.
I mean, they're not intimate letters; they're rants. They're furious.
Well, I mean, intimacy meaning one-on-one communication.
Yeah, but Hahnemann was vehement that with his clients about right living, good living, removal of obstacles, and remedies. And
why that's important is because it removes all the things that lead a case in one direction or another. So if somebody who, has a gluten intolerance or shouldn't have much dairy, comes to you with GI distress, well, without removing the obstacles in the beginning, you're going to weight your prescription on a symptom that is an indisposition. It's not part of the dynamic disease.
Good.
It's an effect of, of a person's lifestyle. Now, of course, one could argue, well, that's susceptibility. But I think that there is there's a point at which Hahnemann is really clear. Take responsibility for the way that you treat this body. Take responsibility for how you're living in it, and then you'll be able to see a much clearer picture as to what's influencing. This is where, we could do an entire podcast on all the things that homeopaths think you're not allowed to have.
We'll do that.
Yeah, we'll definitely do one. But the fixation on mint and coffee, people think that you sign up for homeopathy and you can never brush your teeth again. But that comes from, it's been misinterpreted over the years. It's just Hahnemann saying there are so many substances in your day-to-day life that actually can impact the way that your body tries to achieve equilibrium.
Yeah.
And so if you remove them, you're going to get a clearer picture of the chronicity, and how it presents itself.
I've been living with you for a number of years, and I know that you have 7 conversations at once, and are quite happy with that. But I want you to go back. I want you to tell the story about missing your bus stop. Because remember we were talking about the method book, right?
Yeah.
I think this is relevant.
I don't think it was the method book, was it?
Yeah, it was the one where I said education's a mess.
Oh, yeah.
That was it, right?
Yeah, I think that's... So to back up and to tell the story. So I was teaching for a homeopathy school this might have been 2010 or 11. And I was given a stack of Alastair's books that we were using as textbooks, and I hadn't read them. I'd met you, but I hadn't read the books. Right, because we met before when you were still researching for method anyway. So I'm on the bus, and I'm reading this book, and I pulled out my red pen, and I start, oh my gosh, I can't even believe it. Because part of what you were writing about was just that, homeopathy education was really in the toilet. And I think I took it quite personally that no, actually, there are those of us who are really working to teach good homeopathy. There are a lot of good people teaching good
You
homeopathy.
ended up in the East River or something.
But I missed my bus. So I was living in New York City, and I went the other way. So I was coming from a meeting on the east side.
Oh, okay.
And I got on the bus to take me to my subway stop at 6th Avenue, and I wound up all the way when the bus stopped on the other side. I was so mad marking up your
Looking
book.
at the Hudson. Nice.
But you made some edits for the next edition that I was quite grateful for.
I made a truckload of them. I'll tell you a story about Francis Treuherz, because I went to London. It must have been about 6 months after that book was published, and Francis and I were in contact, and I used to go over to his place, and he would feed me, and we would have these amazing lunches, mainly consisting of bagels, and he's got this incredible collection of books and stuff. So we spent a bit of time, and he said, look, in an email he wrote, Alastair, would you like some comments on your last book? And I said, of course, Francis. And he said, we'll need some time. and I went, okay. And then with some trepidation, I went up the stairs. I got to his house, went up the stairs. He said, do you want to talk about the book, or do you want to have lunch first? And I looked, and in his office, on his desk, was this porcupine. And it was my book with Post-it notes.
Oh dear!
A bit like your
my Organon, yeah.
And I thought, oh, here we go. But look, and to his credit, he set me straight on a couple of things, and he also helped me out with some spelling of, actually mainly of luminaries, because I can't remember. Is Swan 2 N's or 1 N?
Swan is 2 N's.
Right. So
he's my current fascination, Samuel Swan.
Yeah, Samuel Swan. So it was stuff like that at the end of the day, and a couple of other doozies. And what's that thing that my father hates about my grammar? My use of...
Oh, I can't remember.
It's my peculiar sentence structure.
Yes, and I can vouch for that.
Anywho.
Speaking of peculiarities.
Yeah, moving on. All right. So
if we come back to this, which is this idea that the homeopathic case is solved according to Hahnemann, and I spend a lot of my research time, which we'll talk about this in some subsequent podcasts, but right now I'm doing a deep dive into homeopathy in America from 1850 to 1920, with with an even deeper dive into 1860 to 1880. And in reading the primary source materials and the letters between these homeopaths, and also looking at the structure of homeopathy education in its heyday, when there were medical colleges of homeopathy and hospitals here in the United States, the one thing that stands out to me more than anything else, hands down, is the weight that these homeopaths put on the strange, rare, and peculiar symptom. In fact, they solved these cases primarily based on the most characteristic symptom in the case.
All right, got to stop there, because now you're using 4 terms. Mm-hmm. You're talking about strange, rare, peculiar, so 153.
Yeah.
But you're also in the same breath saying characteristic.
Yeah. So we just had a conversation about this with our full-time year 1 class, where we were, they're learning terminology. We're kind of coming to common language, and so it was really funny to say, okay, well, so that you've got a characteristic symptom, and then you've got a strange, rare, and peculiar symptom. What's the difference between them?
There's a big difference.
Well, I mean, there is, but the strange, rare, and peculiar is sort of like the characteristic symptom to the 3rd power.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I'd be happy with that.
Yeah.
But for me, the other day here, I was supervising a case in our clinic, and the client said, "I feel good in a storm." And the student homeopath moved on. They wrote it down, and I could see they're going, oh, characteristic symptom. But then I'm going, because I know the rubrics. No, is it before the storm comes? Is it a thunderstorm? Is it the lightning? Is it when the storm arrives?
Right.
Is it a change of weather?
Yeah.
All right. Now,
because
all
sometimes
of those,
the barometric pressure changes,
right,
and someone gets relief from their symptoms.
So for me, if we just go down the line, I mean, we always start, personally, I'm fine to start with a presenting complaint that a client has, but my job as a homeopath is to modify that complaint, right?
Yep.
So what are the things that make this individual or characteristic to the person? So when I saw a student, so I had a word to them afterwards and said gently, actually that was your opportunity. No, I think it's a lack of familiarity with rubrics.
Yeah, totally. Because learning the materials helps you to learn how to take the case, because you have to know what you're looking for and why.
So a person that has anxiety, which is the presenting complaint, and then we find out feels better in a storm or before the storm arrives with the change of weather and the change of barometric pressure, now that's a characteristic symptom. Would you say that's a strange, rare, peculiar symptom?
It depends on the rest of the case.
So for me, I've always, and this is going back to my days teaching in New Zealand, in Australia, so at the beginning, because I remember standing up in front of a class and spouting on about something, and someone said, well, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah.
And I immediately said, well, for me, a strange, rare, peculiar symptom is something I've never heard before.
No, I disagree.
Right.
And that's not what Hahnemann is saying here. In Aphorism 153, he says, in the search for a homeopathically specific remedy, that is, in the comparison of the complex of the natural disease signs with the symptom sets of the available medicines, the more striking, exceptional, unusual, and odd characteristic signs and symptoms of the disease case are to be especially and almost solely kept in view. These, above all, must correspond to the very similar ones in the symptom set of the medicine sought, if it is to be the most fitting for cure. So then he says, common symptoms like lack of appetite, headache, lassitude, restless sleep, and so on and so forth.
Feel well.
Yeah, that's not really helpful. But here's how I would see it in a case, because it's how it relates to the larger symptom complex. So I will remind you of a case that we had in the teaching clinic back when we were still doing in-person clinics.
In New York.
In New York, and it was Parker's case. And it was a case of a woman who had MS, and the SRP was that she had perspiration that stains the linen. Do you remember that?
I remember the situation, and that's really interesting because for me, with my definition, that would be characteristic.
Except that it was the striking symptom that helped us to choose the remedy. So when we were looking at, say, 3, 4, or 5 remedies that covered the constellation of symptoms, right? You were teaching the clinic. I was just being a nosy body, but you all were sort of grappling with the mental and emotional part of it. And I said, you have a standout physical symptom. So you cannot, it's so stand out because it was really like, it was a part of her life. It happened all the time. And I said, you absolutely must consider this as a symptom. And once you plugged that into your analysis, the answer became very clear. And that case was one of the most rapid turnarounds of a neurological case that I've seen. And so, it'll be interesting. We'll have another podcast where we talk about the mental and emotional aspect of homeopathy, the Aphorism 211, or Hahnemann's, the suite of aphorisms from 210 to 230 that are all about the the treatment of mental and emotional diseases, but in particular how we utilize that information to make the call on a remedy.
So can we go back to the to identifying strange or peculiar?
Sure.
Because I always liked my definition,
yeah.
And I'm totally fine to have to be schooled or to have a different perspective on it. But I always use that as an imperative for homeopaths to become more worldly, to be worldly, because if you've never heard something,
right,
and it stops
everything
you,
seems strange.
That's exactly it. If you stay at home and don't go out, then everything is strange. When it's not. So the point that I suppose I was trying to make is that a strange or peculiar symptom for me is somewhat subjective.
I disagree. Because
good.
it's striking. And so what Hahnemann says in 153 that actually really crystallizes it for me is he says, and this kind of goes back to you with the student who didn't ask about the storm, and you're saying, well, I know the rubrics, therefore, right? Hahnemann's saying you need to know the materia medica. So if you know what is striking in the remedies, you are looking for how that stands out in the case. And that's what you're looking for. You see,
it's really interesting. The other day I was reading over your shoulder. I don't know if you know that.
What was I reading?
Demetriades.
Ah, yeah.
And it was interesting because you must have been preparing for a chronic disease
I was
lecture.
teaching intro to chronic diseases. Yeah.
And I saw a little note, and it said, and I believe it said something along the lines of strange and rare and peculiar is a translation, and it's not necessarily the correct translation, because he said it's a singular symptom. It was really interesting.
But that's true.
Would you say that a singular symptom is a strange or a peculiar symptom? Or is that just now semantics?
Now it's semantics, but it's elevated, and it's elevated,
it's totally elevated
by context,
Yeah.
right? And it's elevated also by the materia medica. So, I mean, for me, that MS case always stands out. I always use that as a teaching example because, well, for a lot of reasons, but one is it was striking. So it was amplified in her case. Yeah, it was a very strong presentation. It wasn't just an odd thing. You know, a lot of times we'll use as an example the red triangle on the tip of the tongue in wrist talks. Okay, well, it's strange, whatever, but how strong is it? Is somebody going to say, you know, all I could think about, you know, look at me. What's the first thing you see? Is this red triangle on the tip of my tongue? I mean, but when somebody says my clothes turn yellow, you know, my clothes are turning yellow from my perspiration. That is, it's striking. And I think Hahnemann uses the term striking, which I find to be really important. Now, I feel like we should start winding down and cleaning up some loose ends. Can I?
What do you mean? I'm getting a groove up here.
Okay, so we had...
so much to talk about.
Well, that's why we're going to do them in segments. We're not going to do... This isn't going to be like one of those Scandinavian movies where people stack wood for 11 hours. So, watch me knit all day. So you mentioned something that I think is super important to point out because, there are going to be people who are listening and consuming this content who maybe have had different exposures into homeopathy.
Yeah, totally.
And one of the things that I think is a really fair assessment of some of the ways that homeopathy is practiced is that people often lose sight of the chief complaint. And that is, right? And so you've got to understand what's happening in the body. If someone has, Crohn's disease, you absolutely must be investigating their digestive system. And it has to be a priority, right? That the remedies, only remedies for which there is an affinity for that organ system should be considered. That's a part of it. And so, there had been a trend in homeopathy years back, and we'll talk about this. This is a byproduct of the Kantian interpretations of homeopathy, where homeopathy got so mentalized and became this treat the whole person. You're finding their soulmate in nature, and it often bypassed that they had a very real, legitimate pathological malfunction that needs to be addressed. So I think it's important to note that good homeopathy always must take into account that chief complaint and the pathological disturbances.
The way I think about that is that chief complaint, and I'd say 70% of the time it's probably physical, and maybe 30% of the time it's of mental or emotional origin.
And if in that 30% of the time, if you look at the aphorisms where Hahnemann says,
right.
Oh, you think it's a one-sided disease, people? Please, that means you didn't do your job.
But the point I was going to make is that it's a portal. That's the way in.
Totally.
And the first thing you do is you write it down, and then you start to modify it. Mm-hmm. Tell me more about that.
And then you look to see how the rest of the case interacts with it. Because what you're looking for is a thematic understanding of multiple aspects of human suffering. And if you do your job, you will have the capacity to synthesize that understanding and to see the case. Like you know that you've got something good when all the pieces fit together in a natural and harmonious synthesized way, and then what floats to the top with that are the characteristic or striking symptoms that have to be considered, or that become the sort of vetting factors for the choice of the remedy.
Yeah, totally. Have you seen those examples of cases? If you scroll through a journal or look at maybe a case study that you've read about, a recent one, and there are these repertorizations with 25 rubrics in them, and
I can't.
I mean,
but you know what though?
And the reason I'm saying that is because those are not characteristic symptoms.
No.
Those are all of the symptoms.
Yeah. So, but don't you think, though, if it's published in a journal, I would consider that a secondary repertorization. It's like what we do in clinic.
Yeah, but sometimes I don't think it is. But the thing you said before, which is so cool.
I was trying to be nice.
Oh, okay.
Kindness always first.
All right. But I love what you said before, and it's a way that that I've learned to understand our specific diagnostic framework in the work that we do, and it's to look for the constellation of symptoms. In the same way that, I don't know, I mean, I think it's a really good word, because if you look up in the night sky, or if you've got the app and you see Scorpio, there's a truckload of stars there. You can only see a couple of them, and at the end of the day, it is those bright stars, those characteristic symptoms in the client's case that will get you to the place you need to go.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. In another podcast, I would love for us to talk about some...
We're going to be doing this every day for the next year.
Some case analysis strategies. Some of the things that I've been working on in my book. The idea of micro-repertorizations and secondary repertorizations, ways to dig into the repertory and to use it, to really use it as a tool of reference that delivers things you might not have thought about.
Well, that's the point, because your repertorization is generally 3 characteristic symptoms.
Exactly.
And not the 20 that the client talked about.
As soon as you do that, you get sulfur.
Sulfur and nux vomica.
Yeah, calcarb.
Yeah.
Maybe lachesis.
Sepia.
Mercury.
Blah, blah, blah.
And then you miss all the other, 6,000 possibilities. So if we're to tie this up in a neat bow, because we entered into this talking about sort of this challenge that homeopaths face in doing our job in a reductionistic world. And sometimes I think we make it more difficult on ourselves, or no, actually, I think it's very difficult for us, especially if we ourselves are struggling. So if somebody has all these symptoms and then they get a diagnosis of Lyme with a little splash of Rocky Mountain spotted fever on the side, and then a little mold, and and they have the MTFHRHFR, I always get it wrong.
Oh, that one.
Right, and all those things, not helpful at all in homeopathy.
No, not.
And right, and I guess something for us to think about is when we are really operating according to Hahnemann's principles, which, funny enough, really work even in the face of the complexity of 21st century complicated diseases. What we are asked to do is to emphasize the idea of that totality, looking for the characteristic symptoms. And I guess the thing I'd love for people to just kind of wrestle with in their own head is, how do you deal with this in your own practice? Because once you start to use ancillary interventions, be they allopathic, I wouldn't say allopathic, because we don't have as much trouble dealing with allopathic medicine and homeopathy cases. It just doesn't. It's not as much of an issue as it is when there are multiple homeopathic interventions, or sometimes if you've got this idea of like a bioidentical intervention, do those things take away the characteristic symptoms that are really what leads us to finding the remedy that guide us.
I love it.
Stranger and peculiar.
Uh-huh.
That's us.
Wow. Well, it is us.
We'll see you again, everyone. Thanks for listening. We hope you learned something.
Take care. See ya.